Hi, and welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to continue talking about pure competition. And on a previous video, we talked about the calculating all these numbers, taking output and price and calculating total revenue, average revenue, marginal revenue, taking fixed costs and variable costs, and using that to calculate all these total cost, average variable, average total, marginal cost, profits, and so on. And then we calculated all of these, and now we got to come back and we got to say what's the goal of the firm. And remember, the goal of the firm from the economics perspective is right here. The goal of the firm is to maximize the profits, is to maximize their profits. And so what we want to do is we want to take all of these numbers and we want to put it onto a graph and use that goal of profit maximization as a way of analyzing firms' behavior. So let's take a look at a graph of this. Actually, before I go to it, you really should try. If you haven't done it, you really should try and graph this. And so let me just kind of draw up what you would want to graph. You'd want to create a graph and put quantity here on the horizontal axis, and your quantity would go from 0 to 11, and then you would want to graph going up here on the vertical axis. We want to graph a couple different items. We want to graph the marginal revenue. You want to graph the average revenue, and you want to graph the price. Now, when you graph, you're going to see the marginal revenue, the average revenue, the price. You're going to find out that they're all the same thing. So they're all going to be the same line. Okay, they're going to be the same curve on the graph. And then on the cost side, you want to graph the average variable cost, so you're going to put that up here as well. So you're going to graph the average variable cost, you're going to graph the average total cost, and you're going to graph the marginal cost. So you're going to graph those 6 items. You're going to graph the average variable cost, average total cost, marginal revenue, average revenue, and the price. So for an example, when we look at the first unit, we would, for example, graph the average total cost, which was 30, and then we would graph the average total cost for the next one, which was 30, and then for the second one, then for the third one, the average total cost was 26, and so on, and then you get all your dots for the average cost, and then you would create your curve, okay, and so you would do that for the average variable cost, for the average total cost, for the marginal cost, and then marginal revenue, average revenue, and price. So you would graph all of those. So what I would recommend doing is just pausing the video for a moment and go ahead and graphing all of those. These are graphs that we've done before. If you've watched some of the previous playlists, we've done the graphs on these costs before. We've done the graph on these costs before. Sorry about that again. We've graphed these before, and what we're adding to the graph are the revenue side. We're adding the revenue side to it. So go ahead, pause, try to graph that, and then come back and we'll take a look at the graph together. All right, so hopefully you were able to draw the graph, and so here's what the graph would look like. So some of this could be a little bit hard to read, so let me just go over this. So this is my marginal cost curve right here. This is the marginal cost curve. This is the average total cost curve, the ATC. This is the average total cost curve, this top one right here. And then this next one, we'll try to write this, is the average variable cost. That's this curve right here, the bottom one, that's the average variable cost. And then we have this curve right here. And this curve really is 4 different curves at once. Okay, that is the things that I told you to graph. It is the marginal revenue, which was 50 every time. It was the price, which was 50 every time. It is the average revenue, which was 50 every time, but it's also something else. It's also the demand curve for the individual firm, and we'll talk about that a lot later, but just notice this demand curve for the individual firm is perfectly elastic. It's perfectly elastic. And that makes sense when we think about what pure competition is, because remember, with pure competition, there's many, many firms all producing the exact same good. There's many, many firms all producing the exact same good. So there's a perfectly elastic demand curve for this particular firm, because if they tried to raise their price, well, people would just go buy the good from another firm producing the exact same product. Okay, so it makes sense. The economic concept of perfectly elastic makes sense, and it makes sense because there are many, many firms all producing the exact same product. And that's why you have a perfectly elastic demand curve for the individual firm. Now, the way we want to think about this graph, and this graph can be very confusing, the way we want to think about it is we want to get what I'm going to call tunnel vision. So what do I mean by tunnel vision? So we got this whole graph here. We don't want to be looking at this whole graph. It all looks very confusing. What we want to do is we want to focus in on just one part of the graph. What part of the graph are we going to focus on? Well, it turns out that a firm maximizes its profits when it produces where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. It's kind of like human behavior. You maximize utility when the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. Well, similar concept. Okay, we're going to maximize profit when the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost, and that happens when we produce when the here's the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue. So that's going to happen right here, where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, and that's, I guess, is right here at 6 units. Okay, so what we do is we get tunnel vision right there. We find where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, and then we draw this vertical line. And that's where we're going to produce, okay, where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. So then what we do is where we have that vertical line, that's where we're going to get what I just called tunnel vision. That's the part of the graph we're going to focus on. So we then come up to the average revenue curve, which is this. We come up to the average revenue curve, and we come over and we mark that, and that's going to be the average revenue, which for this firm is equal to 50. That's going to be the average revenue. And then I'm going to come up and I'm going to mark the average total cost. And let me just switch my color up here. I'm going to come up here to the average total cost. Okay, this is where I got tunnel vision on this vertical line, and I'm going to come to the average total cost. That's this curve right here. Here's the average total cost, and I come across, and the average total cost, I have to go back and check the number, what the number is. When we produce 6 units, I come back here, and I say, when we produce 6 units, what is that number? The average total cost was $33.33 per unit. So let's come back here and mark that. The average total cost is $33.33 per unit. Okay, now, so what does that tell us? What's the big deal with that? Well, we can use average revenue to calculate the total revenue. That is to say that the total revenue is equal to the average revenue multiplied by the level of output. Okay, so you take the level of output, which in our example is 6, and you multiply that by the average revenue per unit sold, which is 50, and that's going to give you the total revenue that the company brings in, which is $300. Now, where do we find that on the graph? Well, if we complete the rectangle, we come here from 6, and we come all the way up here to the average revenue. Let me just make that a little thicker. We come all the way up to the average revenue and come across and complete that rectangle. So if we do that, what is that rectangle going to be equal to? What's that rectangle going to be equal to? Well, the height of that rectangle, which happens to be 50, is the average revenue. And then the base of it, which is 6, is equal to the quantity. And we know that if we multiply base times height, that we get the area. And we know if we multiply the quantity times the average revenue, and the quantity happens to be the base, and the average revenue happens to be the height. So we know if we multiply those two things together, we're going to get the area, and we also know it's going to be the total revenue. So in other words, what I can say is if I multiply quantity base times height average revenue, I will get the area of this rectangle, which is the firm's total revenue. Okay, so this is the total revenue. This box is the total revenue, which happens to be equal to 300. The area of that box is the total revenue. Now, what about the total cost? Where are we going to find the total cost? Well, the total cost, that has a box as well. The total cost box is going to be, okay, we're going to produce 6 units, so that's going to be my base. And then, sorry, let me write out the formula here, then I'll come back here in a second. The total cost is equal to the average total cost multiplied by quantity. Just as the total revenue is equal to the average revenue times quantity, the total cost is average total cost times quantity. Okay, the quantity, I just drew it here. That's the base, which is equal to 6. That's the base, which is equal to 6. Now, what's the average total cost? The average total cost is right here. It's the height. Okay? It's the height of this rectangle going up to the average total cost curve. Okay? Right there. If we come up to that average total cost curve and come across, my average total costs are $33.33. Multiply those two together, and you're going to get total cost equal to 200. So again, it's same concept. It's quantity times the average, in this case average total cost. So it's the quantity, which is here on the base, multiplied by the height, which is the average total cost, which is 33.33. And when you multiply the base times height, that's going to give you the area of the rectangle. And the area of the rectangle, as it turns out, the area of the rectangle is the total cost, because it's quantity, which is the base, multiplied by average total cost, which is the height. So this box is going to be the total cost box. And the total cost we calculated to be equal to, I'll write it down here, which is equal to 200. Now, what that gives us is in between those two, in between the total revenue and the total cost, this is the total revenue box, and of that total revenue, part of that's going to the total cost, and then what's left over is called your profit. And that's going to be this area here in between. That's going to be your profit. So right there is going to be the profit. Okay? And what's the profit equal to? The profit, which we're going to designate with pi, the profit is equal to 300 times 200. The profit is $100. And we want to be careful to say that that is economic profit. That is economic profit. And that means, remember what economic profit means. That means that we are beating our next best opportunity. Okay? It's not just that our revenue is above our cost. It also means that we're doing better than any other thing we could have done with our resources. It means if I'm producing pizza, I'm making more money than if I would go produce hamburgers. Okay? Remember that concept from some earlier videos. That's the concept of economic profit. So notice what we did here. We used our averages. Okay, first we used margins, marginal revenue and marginal cost to figure out our level of production. And then we drew our vertical line. We got our tunnel vision. Okay? And then what we did, once we used marginal revenue and marginal cost to find where we were going to produce, where our vertical line was at 6 units, then we used our averages to find the totals. We used the averages to find our totals. We used average revenue to find the total revenue box. We used average total cost to find the total cost box. And then in between those, in here, that was our economic profit. That was our economic profit. Now, we just did this with numbers, okay? This was very concrete. We did it with numbers. In the future, we need to do this in an abstract way without using numbers, okay? But I'm not going to do that in this video because I've already gone a little bit long. So we'll do this again in a more abstract way. This is a really important concept. As a microeconomics student, you've got to be able to draw these graphs, and you've got to be able to find these different areas on the graph. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.